Okay, welcome again to KGG 507, including at least one new person who's freshly enrolled for all the surveying students, and KGA 512 for everybody who's doing planning. So hopefully you're well aware that there's a quiz that opens tonight and stays open until 11 o'clock on Friday. It should be pretty easy if you have read the material and watched the lectures so far. There are a bunch of questions that are worth 20 questions that are worth half a mark each for 10 marks. If you haven't prepared it all, you will find it really hard to finish it in the 90 minutes. But if you're pretty well prepared, it should be easy. Well, pretty straightforward anyway. So there's quite a bit going on. I'm going to share my screen again and this time go to Milo, just to remind people, that's the wrong version of Milo. Sorry, I have tons of things open. How about that? No. Can you see Milo? I'm seeing a slightly different screen. Can you hear me?
Yes, Emma.
Okay. Whew. All right. Can you see the front page of Milo? Okay. Okay. All right. I'll keep going. So for anybody who's feeling a little bit deprived of face-to-face contact, there's a couple of important things happening this week that are particularly aimed at young planners. So the first one is the UTAS Society lunch this Friday. All of this can be found through the Master of Planning blog. If you haven't already signed up to that blog, I'd recommend you doing that. So if you scroll down to the lunch by the UTAS Planning Society, all the details are there. You do need to register. You do need to pay for your lunch, but the society has booked the venue, and yeah, it'll be a really good opportunity to meet some of your teachers face to face, as well as meet last year's students and people who are still going through. So the other thing that's happening around the state, for those of you who don't have access to Hobart, is the Meet, Eat and Greet with Tasmanian Young Planners. So there's something happening in Launceston this Friday, up at the fabulous new pizza ovens. Well, they're not new, but they were new last year and we couldn't use them. Up on the Domain this Saturday, and then at Turners Beach on Saturday 27th. So yeah, a really good opportunity to meet a few more people. So thanks for anybody who's just done the survey. Our head of school thought it would be a good idea to check in with you sooner rather than later. We don't want to get to the end of semester and realise that we're missing things or we're being really annoying in some way that maybe we can do something about. So thank you for doing the survey. All right, so I'm going to actually have to stop that share and start this one. Okay, so the quiz. All the important terms were on that handout. Thanks to the person last week who said that one of the links to the next quiz, not this quiz, wasn't working. I fixed that, and that's now up in week 3 content. The only one that is a little bit sort of tangential, I actually don't ask any quiz questions about, is the State Policies and Projects Act. This will come into your rezoning application at the end of the semester, but look, it is important in sort of understanding the structure of how planning works in Tasmania, but state policies really don't come into use all that much, which is why we tend to ignore them. So just by way of remembering where the heck we've got to with this unit, so you should be familiar with what the RMPS is. There are for sure questions about this. There are all these lofty goals, and then we get into the messy business of actually making the system work through the Land Use Planning and Approvals Act, through planning schemes. And as we get through, particularly as we start into next week, and we look in detail at the heritage case study in Battery Point, and we go to that site, for those of you in Hobart the week after, this will all start making sense. So if it's just feeling like a whole lot of words at the moment, just stick with it. It is important to get a grasp on this background. And hopefully today will happen because we're mostly focusing on a case study to try to figure out how on earth this all fits together. Heads up that one of the words that wasn't in that list that I should have put in this list, because it is introduced briefly this week, but I have got 2 quiz questions about Aboriginal heritage. It sits outside the normal planning process, but it's super important in terms of planning legislation, and you do need to understand that a permit is required if, much like if you're going to harm threatened species, there's potential to be harming Aboriginal heritage. You've got to go out and have a look. You might need a formal assessment. If you've listened to the lecture, you'll be fine. And the other lecture things that you will need to do before you do the quiz. So if you haven't already done these, hopefully you have, but if you haven't, make sure that you at least run through all of video 1, the first half of video 2. Video 3 is less important, but these between them, they will give you a really good introduction to EPBC, what it is, how it's supposed to work, and how it's really not working in a lot of cases. So I wanted to try to avoid me doing tons of talking. I know it's a bit awkward in Zoom, but I also know that at least a couple of you do know a fair bit about Lake Malvina. So we did this in class, not last year, the year before. I was just hoping that it would just be at the start of the class and that it wouldn't sort of take up all that much time. We spent 2 hours talking through this. We had the whiteboard boards in Harvard 1 completely full, figuring out who were all the actors, what had happened, how did the Commonwealth get involved. And it was a bit torturous because it is complicated, but because this case study draws on threatened species, Aboriginal heritage is involved, because it's controversial, because it's been in the news, because people care about this one way or another, it worked incredibly well as a device to help you think about actually, in practice, how on earth does all this hang together? So this is a screenshot from the very last part of week 3 Milo page. I do update the Milo page on Wednesdays. I really can't get to it before Wednesdays. I have Mondays off, Tuesdays is costs, coordination, administration. So I hope that's not too inconvenient for anybody who would like to get in earlier, just not possible for me to get in. All right, so this is where we can start doing a bit of practical work. So if you've got access to a browser, this is a good opportunity to open up the list and search at the very top. It's quite a small box, but this is where you type your address. We practiced typing 14 Earl Street last time. Search Halls Island. I wasn't sure whether this would work, but I tried it today. Bang, up it pops, like magic. So, I'm going to keep talking as a sort of playing elevator music moment, but if you open up the list, search on Halls Island, then you can try turning on a couple of layers like we did before. I won't scroll down and show you the result till you have a bit of a go at it, but this is where you've got a bamboozling number of layers that you can try turning on and off. And the ones that we really want on for planning purposes is the planning zone at least. And I like changing the base map to the Esri satellite image, just gives you a bit more detail. Somebody who likes vegetation, it's just my preferred view. Maybe surveyors might be more comfortable with something else, that's fine. The point is to get the list open and find the location. So this lets you tackle at least the first couple of questions. So if anybody either wants to type into the chat or unmute, so where on earth is Halls Island? Particularly for those of you who are in WA and Victoria and maybe you've seen this in the news, but not actually sure where it is. I'll open the chat screen. So this is important. Where is the development? It's always important because planning is about matching up the development with the location, but the location is particularly juicy in this case. So where is it? Let's try and volume. I can't hear anybody, but maybe that's because you're typing into the chat. Yeah, okay, so it's in the Walls, and the Walls is a really special part of Tassie. It's part of Wilderness World Heritage Area. It's kind of right in the middle of Tasmania. Yes, it is in the Twa. And so you can see when you type in Halls Island, why everybody refers to it as Lake Malbina. So the development is on Halls Island, but it's in Lake Malbina, and Malbina is the shortcut. So in the list, if you just single click on Halls Island and you've got your planning zones as a layer, it should tell you which planning scheme applies. Has anybody got to that screen? Yes, so awesome, Tom. Central Highlands Interim Planning Scheme. So you know a bunch of things. This is work I prepared earlier. You know a bunch of things from this view. You can scroll in and out to see the environment, and very quickly you get the gist that this is wilderness. You know that it's the Central Highlands Council under their interim planning scheme that is the rules, basically. You know that it's in environmental management zone. So this is also really important because some things are allowed in some zones and not others. That's the whole point of zoning. So you also know that if you get into iPlan, and I know at least one person can't access iPlan, but there's various ways of reading the schemes. This is the one that we've pointed to. The Central Highlands Planning Scheme is the one that applies. Again, this is a screenshot. It's one of the ones that hasn't been finished, which is why it's interim. Hobart is still interim, Clarence is still interim. That's one that you'll use in the second half of the semester because their councils are still working with the Tasmanian Planning Commission to put the Tasmanian Planning Scheme into play. Some have, some haven't. This hasn't. So you can see here too that all the planning schemes look much the same, which makes planners' lives a whole lot easier than 5 years ago. And you can see here how things have been adapted. So there is no inner residential zone when it comes to Central Highlands. So these are the words that are there. But when you go down to the environmental management zone, and if you've got the little book icon clicked at the top, it doesn't hide the pages, it's all there. Then you can see what the zone purpose is. And as with the RMPS objectives, this is important because unlike inner residential, it's not about trying to pack people in isn't the right word, trying to have higher density, well-serviced residential areas. It's about the protection, conservation, management of, I've cut this off a bit, of natural values. It's to allow for development that is consistent with protection of these values, is to facilitate passive recreational activities, things like bushwalking. So you can see that repeatedly there's references to natural values and protection and conservation. And then, yeah, you can have a look at the rest of the zone description in your own time, but this is a good place to start. This is basically the zone rules. So this is where we smush together the development and the location. So I've zoomed out a little bit so that you see the environmental management zone that is all in this dark green with a little blue dot that is Halls Island, and then rural resource, which is nearby farming area, or some of it's still bush, but some of it's farm. So without worrying about what the planning scheme might say, how do you, I'll get everybody working on this before I have a look at your chat message, Jack. Just from common sense, what planning issues might arise between the development, which is these 4 pods, it's called a standing camp, and this is where arguments about terminology is important. 4 pods on this island that are being accessed by helicopter. It's an 8-hour walk-in. Visitors as part of this package are helicoptered in and out. So it's quite a substantial number of helicopter flights. And these actual pods that are helicoptered in, what issues might there be rules about? So have a think about that. Yeah, Jack, so the definitions for the terms are all further down in the zone description. So it has the objective, sometimes it has a character statement, and then there's a table that actually defines all of these things. So if you go into the actual version, I don't have a screenshot of it, of the Central Highlands Interim Planning Scheme, click that little book, otherwise things are kind of hidden from you, and then you can scroll right down through environmental management zone to your heart's content. We'll see that definitions are really important, and decisions are made on arguments about, you know, what a standing camp means, and, you know, how to actually interpret the rules, because it's not necessarily just a straightforward, no worries, Ruth, it's good you can make it, not necessarily just a really straightforward mapping. Interpretation is a really important part of it. So it's the wilderness. There are lots of helicopter flights. There are pods being helicoptered in there. They're not permanent, except they are going to be there for a while. What do you think? And you can either unmute or type into the chat. What do you think are going to be issues that council's going to need to think about? Yes. So yeah, Tom, there's the actual influence in the local area. It's a wilderness area, and you can see from the objectives that protecting that is really important. So there's going to be actual site impacts. Wilderness impacts are huge and get repeatedly mentioned. Exactly how this gets captured in the rules is a tricky matter. So Tom is on the right, well, you're all on the right track, but rules around how far things are from waterways, what gets discharged in waterways, and all of the permit conditions that say, well, okay, you can have these pods, but actually you've got to helicopter all your waste out, or This is how you've got to treat the grey water before it gets discharged. All of that gets really tightly controlled. And this is where some things that people care about are in the rules and get assessed, and some aren't. So carbon emissions, Australia is pretty crap at planning for carbon emissions. It doesn't get mentioned really much at all. There's discussion around the new version of the national legislation, EPBC, doing a better job of this, but at the moment, not so good. Yeah, so all of this is, there's lots of good suggestions here. And so this is what happens when a development's proposed. You think about all the different ways it could pollute the environment. You look at the controls and you match them up. And maybe there's some things that people are cross about that aren't controlled, and there's really not that much that can be done about that sometimes. Yeah, so this is where discussions about the scale of what is appropriate comes into it, whether it fits other planning tools, the management plan, as Jack points out. Yeah, making sure that it's touching the earth lightly. So this has been carefully designed and the developer has thought it through, and it is pretty self-contained, but you're definitely on the right track in terms of thinking all of this through. So, okay, here's another question. So there's two separate things here. There's planning issues that council needs to think about. There's planning issues that we've got international obligations around that the Commonwealth Minister needs to think about. For those of you who either know the history of this case or know what's controlled in that national legislation, what matters might the Commonwealth need to investigate when it comes to this development? Hopefully you're frantically typing. And part of the reason for asking this is that there are some quiz questions, not specifically about a case study, but there's questions. Yeah, so actually there are two different sets of controls here. There's council controls, and then there's the possibility of national controls. So what issues that might come up here might the Commonwealth need to get involved in? So EPBC is the national legislation. If you haven't already listened to those lectures, make sure you do, or at least two of the quiz questions are going to be very difficult. And so there are all sorts of triggers where Australia has obligations, international obligations, and in that way, they're allowed to meddle in what I guess could be considered local issues. So threatened species, things that are listed, whether that's species or community level at the national level, Australia has obligations to protect those. All right, so this is the referral, well, part of the documentation, the referral about Halls Island Standing Camp at Lake Malbina to the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act for the Minister to make a decision. So yeah, Jack, there's a whole separate hoo-ha controversy about RAA, a Reserve Activity Assessment. And yeah, this is still in a bit of a tangle, given the state government's desire to have developments in parks. So this is the trigger. This is part of the documentation where a development in Tasmania that might need to have Commonwealth assessment gets sent up for referral. So the proponent needs to fill in a bunch of paperwork and tick some boxes. So you can see here that a bunch of no boxes have been ticked. I won't list it all, but this is part of that documentation that originally went up. The proposal is not likely to have a significant impact on MNES, Matters of National Environmental Significance. That will roll off your tongue partway through the semester. You'll get used to that. Including values in the Twa, the wilderness, the eagle, lots of discussion about impacts on the eagle in this case. Alpine sphagnum bogs and fens. This is an endangered, threatened community at the Commonwealth level. So yeah, and as part of the summary, right up the front, they flagged that the proposal is locally contentious with a whole lot of submissions from individuals and through various campaigns. So hopefully from the lecture material, threatened species, nuclear actions, wetlands, there's a whole lot of MNES, Matters of National Environmental Significance. If you think your development, however modest, it may just be that you've got a threatened orchid on your property, you think they might be impacted, you need to refer it for consideration. So this is a screenshot out of the first of those 3 videos. The EPBC Act considers, here we go, I don't need to remember it, World Heritage, National Heritage, Ramsar listed wetlands, threatened species, migratory species, nuclear actions, marine areas, including Grimpa, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park, Commonwealth land, and the next slide in the video just put a slightly finer point on that. Basically species that are listed at the national level, species that move around, species that are part of the Ramsar wetland, national heritage lists, whales, certain fishing activities all have to be assessed. You'll notice that Aboriginal heritage isn't mentioned. So does anybody know why? Why was this not mentioned here? Why was Aboriginal heritage not part of this referral documentation?
Is it because they have a separate legislation?
Yes, exactly. So this is from the actual documentation, although, and you can see that a bunch of it's been redacted before it's been given to me. The Aboriginal Heritage Act and the Aboriginal Relics Act protects things at the state level. This is not Commonwealth business. This is separate state legislation. So this is a critique that we will come back to when we do Geilston Bay and get into the planner's report and the rezoning application. This is not a Commonwealth matter, so it's not listed here, and Wild Drake did not have to refer to it. Sorry, they did have to refer to it, but not in that documentation. So I know this is a bit of reading, but there's no, this was what was concluded. So if you think there might be concerns about Aboriginal heritage, you do need to get out, have a look, and maybe ask the Aboriginal Heritage Tasmania. And in this case, an assessment was done, and the conclusion was that there was no requirement for Aboriginal heritage investigation. Aboriginal Heritage Tasmania had no objection to the project proceeding. Redacted, redacted, redacted. The last bit is important, part 2. If at any time during the work you suspect that you have uncovered Aboriginal heritage, you need to act on it or you're committing an offence. So part of the reason for looking at Lake Malvina is that Aboriginal heritage was an issue. So it was assessed and people are unhappy with that. Some people are unhappy with this assessment, but as people are studying planning, you need to know about the process that sits behind this. So I wonder whether there is a bamboozling amount of documentation associated with this case. So I copied from part of the council documentation what people got upset about. There's pages and pages of this. This is a special meeting that the Central Highlands Council held to discuss the development application before the councillors made a decision, before they voted on it. And I just screenshotted this because 2 people who are very senior in the Tasmanian Aboriginal community are on this page. Heather Sculthorpe, who's the CEO of the TAC, and Rodney Dillon, who represents a different body. So they've both had their say here. And so those of you with a planning background might be able to see where I'm going with this. There's issues that are in the rules and issues that people are upset about that are not in the rules. And unfortunately, it's really only the rules that are taken into account ultimately. So you can see at the top here, Jane Malecki was concerned about noise, concerned about impact on a threatened species, was concerned about the amenity of the area, all important planning issues, because if you remember back to the environmental management zone, these are all part of the zone objectives and they're part of the planning scheme for this area. Unfortunately for the 2 people raising concerns here about Aboriginal heritage, the process was followed and it was assessed that there were no concerns. So yeah, and there's also some things mentioned here that they're not planning issues. Heather Sculthorpe reminds councils that it's okay to stand up and say no to the application. Well, they can have a personal opinion, but they're the planning authority, and this is not a popularity contest. They're charged with matching the development against the planning scheme. So I've underlined the things that do have merit in terms of the planning scheme, but there's a bunch of summaries here that really, obviously people are very upset about it, but they're raising matters that really the councillors shouldn't be taking into account when they make their decision. So what do the council planner recommend? So this is part of what the planner wrote. So it appears in the minutes of Central Highlands Council, and this is what they're making a decision on. So the planner said that the proposal is substantially compliant with the requirements of the planning scheme. She recommends that the planning authority approve the development application for use and development of visitor accommodation of these pods on Hall Island. And then she writes out in planning language what she thinks the conditions should be for that permit. So does anybody know what happened next? Yes. So that's incredibly concise, Jack. So Jackie Tyson, so this is another sort of, I guess it's not just a Tasmanian issue. Central Highlands Council is really small. If you read the council document that I've put into Milo, you'll see that they're making decisions about raffles and sewerage problems and a charity bike event in the area. This was just huge for them to consider, a huge amount of pressure, incredibly stressful. Some of the, they're not called aldermen anymore, some of the councillors went on record as saying, we were just so not prepared for this. They don't have a full-time planner at Central Highlands Council. So Jackie Tyson is a consultant planner who does a bunch of work for councils. And Jackie was given the unenviable task of writing the planner's report. You will write a planner's report for Geilston Bay. She wrote the planner's report for Lake Malbina. She advised that the application for visitor accommodation in this zone, in the environmental management zone, is a permitted use. She knows that people are upset about it, but she said, you know, there's other processes at play here, but it's not relevant to the planning scheme, and in her expert advice as a planner, a permit should be given. So then there's a couple of pages of the councillors questioning the proponent, including juicy things like why are 3 pages of community consultation with Parks and Wildlife Service about the reserve activities statement totally blacked out? Who said statutory planning was boring? All of that is in Milo if you want to go through it, but yeah, a long and complicated case. So this is interesting because council went against the advice of their planner. Doesn't often happen, but in this case, there were hundreds of people literally at this special meeting and an immense amount of pressure on them. 3 people, including the mayor, voted along the lines of what Jackie recommended, and 6 people went against the motion. So yeah, a really big ask by a very small and under-resourced council. Then, yep, I'll actually, because I've still got a bit of time, when we've gone through these, I'll go to Milo and I'll show you where everything is. Oh, actually, it's on this page. So if I annotate, here's a bit of an introduction to ABC because the paperwork is a little bit overwhelming. So maybe read that first. I've taken screenshots out of this Central Highlands report, and if you're interested, this does make for interesting reading because you can see what Central Highlands normally deals with, really local stuff. It's obviously important locally, but really not resourced and prepared for this kind of storm that was descended upon them. And then there's also a link to the Resource Management and Planning Appeal Tribunal decision. They heard the matter fresh. So I'm realising I'm doing a lot of talking again. It wasn't supposed to happen. Zoom's not conducive to easy discussion and there's a lot to get through. But what happens if people are cross is that you can appeal to the tribunal and it's heard what's called de novo, it's heard fresh. And the tribunal can take whatever they want into consideration in making a decision about the rules. And they, if I clear this, they found in favour of the proponent and made a fresh decision and gave them a planning permit. A whole lot of things have happened since then, but basically the proponents continue to win and eventually get the necessary approvals to put in these pods and fly people in and out. So it is 3:40. In theory, we've got 10 minutes left. I've got a few more things to show you, but that was quite a lot quite quickly. What I was hoping that we would do is use this to further think through who are all the actors in the Tasmanian system and the process. If we've got time, we can do that, but I just wanted to pause to let you either ask questions or make comments.
Yeah, it's just interesting. I was just wondering why there wasn't sort of more weight put on the community, the public protests around the development. I mean, like it was all in the news, and they had the issues with coppers flying in, all these things, but it just seemed it was basically ignored with when they assessed it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Craig. So basically, planning is not a popularity contest, and the decision makers, including the council who are acting as a planning authority, and then subsequently the tribunal, need to apply the rules. And so their decision is often really difficult and done under intense public and media scrutiny, but they need to set that aside and focus on what the rules say. So then I guess that raises the bigger question of whether the rules are dysfunctional. And part of the reason I put those particular videos up about the EPBC Act, I could have put something up that was much more neutral. And I know that they have a particular perspective about the EPBC being dysfunctional, but it is. And we do need to name up places where the rules seem to be working and places where the rules are not working, and EPBC is not working particularly well. Hopefully by now you'll also have got the sense that maybe assessment of Aboriginal cultural heritage also not working all that well, because it sits outside the planning system in Tasmania and because it is often ignored and there's no formal triggers to assess Aboriginal heritage. It should be done, but it often isn't done, and particularly in an out of the way place where maybe nobody's holding the developer to account, things just get destroyed. Yes, Jack, thank you. Currently is with the Environment Minister. So there's been a couple of goes at this. The initial decision, so that referral, sorry, this is scrolling a bit fast, that went up to the Minister in July, in mid-2018, the Minister decided that there was nothing to be concerned about and said it wasn't a controlled action and the Commonwealth didn't want to be involved further. That was challenged in court, and the Environmental Defenders Office and the Tasmanian Wilderness Society won, and that has gone back up to the Minister. I have lost track of where all of this has got to, but the developer has consistently got the approvals that he has needed. Yes, so the other really important thing about this is that statutory planning sits inside this much bigger social and political system. So if we think of a bunch of controversial developments, for example, the Mount Wellington cable car is going to come up this year. It's one thing to have all the paperwork in order and to be able to actually follow the rules. It's quite something else to be able to make a development like that happen, given that we haven't got so many tourists around as we used to, and not upset the local community so much that it becomes a political football. So Craig, this relates to your comments. Sometimes things get massively political, and sometimes it goes as far as special acts of parliament being passed to make things happen. This happened with the pulp mill. At a certain point, the Premier At the time, Lennon decided enough was enough, pulled it out of the planning process, fast-tracked special legislation to give the pulp mill a permit and just rammed it through. Ashley, what do you mean by is it detail for the quiz? Is the Lake Malvina is not specifically mentioned in the quiz? I just keep it higher level, kind of factual. What do you know about EPBC? What do you know about RMPS? Get you to show me that you understand some key planning terms, that you know what a planning scheme is. Feel free to type if that's not clear enough. I'm going to stop sharing that and instead share my Milo page. I think that's the right one. This one? Yes, this one. All right. So the other thing to notice is that I have unhidden a bunch of resources in Milo. So you can now see all 4 of the sections in Milo that relate to the 4 assessments, well 3 if you're in the surveying class. The quiz, which is open after class today. The next quiz, which is another quiz, but it also involves writing something about a case study in Battery Point. The first bit of the planner's report, which is about Geilston Bay. I've put an example of the planner's report up there, which is actually Battery Point, and unhidden all of the documentation. It's probably a little bit much for now, but look, if you're desperate to know what's coming up, knock yourselves out. And then finally, somebody in the face-to-face class who's in surveying unit asked me, what on earth is a rezoning application? Fair question. I've put 2 examples up. So I haven't unhidden the content because I think that's not helpful at this point. But I have included an Oatlands rezoning example that is really quite similar to what you would write for Geilston Bay. So if you're desperate to get ahead and see what's in store, particularly if you're a surveying student, because that's 70% of your mark, go for it. There's one that's a lot like what you're going to do, and then there's a much more complicated one that actually Bunfu wrote when she was working as a consultant that we'll use in class, but is a bit more than what we're going to ask you to do. All right, it's 3:48. I've got about 5 minutes before I need to run over to chemistry. What else would it be helpful for me to cover? It's hard to remember to look at the camera. I've got windows open all over the place. Is everyone comfortable with what you're going to need to do when the quiz opens at 7 o'clock tonight? Actually, I can see that you've sent me a file, but I can't get it open. Oh, are you asking? Are you asking about, because I know that there is a lot of content over the first 3 weeks. This is a big question. If you're asking me how much detail you need, I can say there's 20 questions worth half a mark each. I'm not trying to punish you and make it really hard. This is to encourage you to get over this hurdle of, oh my goodness, what are all these new terms? Why is this unit got such a heavy emphasis on the law? It is important for being able to fight your way through stat planning case studies. Okay. It's 10:02. I won't be on email tonight, but if anything does happen in terms of your access to the quiz, then just let me know. I'll be checking email first thing tomorrow. You all have one attempt and you've got 90 minutes with, I think, 5 minutes grace. So good luck. If you've reviewed the material and you've listened to the lectures and you've read the EDO handbook, at least chapter 5, you shouldn't have any problems. An hour and a half will be tons of time to get through those questions. No worries. Good luck.